This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. World leaders of the top 20 economies are gathered in St. Petersburg, Russia today. Just a couple of hours ago, President Obama shook hands with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two cordial, despite the debate over Syria, as you can see there with their handshake. Now, Syria is not officially on the agenda at the G20 summit, but it's definitely not being brushed aside. Officials are most likely using their free time to discuss a possible strike between meetings. Now let's bring in ABC's Kirit Radia, who is in St. Petersburg. Kirit, the interactions between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, we saw that handshake, looked okay. How are things going so far?
Well, that was the interesting thing, right? Everybody expected these two leaders to be fighting and duking it out, but when President Obama got out of the car, it's like nothing even happened. So that was the only indication we've seen so far, the only interaction between the two leaders. They're currently at a dinner, or they'll be going to a dinner very shortly, where they may have a chance to interact again. They don't have any plans to meet one-on-one, but they will obviously be in the same meetings in the same room, and there's a chance that they may interact there.
Speaking of being in the same room, there's word that the seating arrangements were changed just to get a little bit more distance between the two world leaders. Can you expand on that?
Well, there was one Russian report saying that they had decided to split them up and put them on opposite ends of the table. We asked the White House aide about that, and they say this is the first they'd heard of it. They don't think that that's actually an accurate report. But you know, certainly everybody in the room is looking at the body language between these two leaders, because it's, like you said, the big topic of the day.
So we had the president's deputy press secretary, who's accompanying him to the summit, giving a little insight into how Obama plans to make his case for Syria while he's there. Obviously, this is a conference where economic issues are going to be discussed. How does the president plan to proceed?
Right. Well, like you said, this is an economic and trade conference, usually, or summit, I should say. But President Putin has said that he wants this to be raised at the dinner this evening. President Obama is also planning to raise it, according to his aides, on the sidelines of the meetings. They plan on, he said they plan on doing this on the margins. He's going to be talking to several of the leaders about the importance of having a unified stand of the world, showing that the chemical weapons are not something that should have any place in modern history.
Interesting time for the president. You know, he's trying to get some of these world leaders aside and talk to them and make the case for intervention in Syria. Meanwhile, back at home, he's got to monitor members of Congress who may or may not be going his way on this issue.
Yeah, like you said, several members of Congress from both parties are still trying to make up their mind of where they stand on this issue. The White House says that they feel very confident in the trend lines. They feel like they're going to get to the point where Congress will authorize the use of force in Syria. And the White House is now putting this in terms of American leadership. They say that if the U.S. doesn't do this, there will be a, quote, vacuum in the international community.
Now, let's talk about President Putin for a moment. On the eve of this summit, he made some pretty strong comments. He doesn't appear to be wavering from his stance against intervention in Syria. He actually accused Secretary of State John Kerry about lying, saying, quote, "He's lying. I know he's lying." Tell us about some of Putin's rhetoric on the eve and now the beginning of this summit.
Right. Well, that was something that President Putin said yesterday in some televised remarks here in Russia. He was referring to Secretary Kerry's testimony on the Hill earlier this week. He accused Secretary Kerry of denying the fact that there were al-Qaeda-backed elements in Syria. Of course, that doesn't seem to hold up when you look at the transcript of Secretary Kerry's remarks. He did talk about al-Qaeda-backed groups. But it is indicative, I think, of the level of mistrust coming out of the Kremlin these days. You know, the Russians really do think that the Americans want to go in and topple the Assad regime. They point to the case of Libya, where the U.S. got involved for ostensibly humanitarian reasons and then continued to bomb government positions until the Gaddafi government was toppled. So this is just one more sign from the Russians that they really don't trust the U.S. intentions here.
What about Germany? We're hearing they have apparently begun to pressure Russia to change its stance. What have you been hearing?
Right. Well, you know, Germany is one of Russia's closest allies in Europe. It's one of their largest trading partners in Europe, and it's a relationship that Russia typically values very much because it is such an important economic relationship at the very least. And so, you know, keep in mind also that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, has a very tough situation coming up as well with regard to supporting this. She's facing her own election soon, and she's very mindful of the fact that one of her predecessors supported the war in Iraq and ultimately lost his place because of that.
Now, we've learned that just next week, after the summit wraps up, the foreign minister of Syria will be coming to Moscow. How much pressure is expected? Is it expected that Syria may exert on Russia or vice versa?
Right. Well, that's right. Foreign Minister Muallim of Syria is coming to Moscow next Monday. He's going to meet with the Russian foreign minister. You know, this is a long relationship going back decades of cooperation between Russia and Syria, and obviously the Russians have been very reluctant. They've been, indeed, have not thrown Assad under the bus. They've continued to provide him with arms, with funding, and with political cover by vetoing any measures of pressure against him in the United Nations Security Council. It will be very interesting to see what happens on Monday's meeting. At this point, the Russians have shown no indication that they're willing to change their policy. In fact, they're doubling down on it and insisting that foreign intervention in Syria will only lead to further instability in the country and in the region.
Kirit, let's go back in time a little bit. President Obama was initially supposed to precede the G20 summit in Russia with 1 or 2 day meeting with Vladimir Putin. He cut that meeting out altogether after Russia gave Edward Snowden asylum. Is that issue still pervasive in these talks and the relationship between Putin and Obama?
Yeah, well, this was supposed to have happened this week, right before this summit. The two were supposed to get together in Moscow and talk about U.S.-Russia relations. You know, the Snowden issue, according to U.S. officials, was really just the straw that broke the camel's back. They say that there were a whole host of other things that were eating away at the relationship. They say the Russians were not responsive when the U.S. proposed several ideas on things from arms control to missile defense, and they saw no reason to go forward with the talks. And then once Edward Snowden was granted asylum, they say that was the last straw. They weren't interested in going forward. Those issues are still big things in the relationship. Obviously, Syria is something that they disagree with on very deeply. But keep in mind that these are other issues. You know, if they ever get past this, there are still a bunch of other things that they will have to deal with. Again, missile defense, arms control, going forward for many years. So don't discount the fact that that those issues are very important and still very big divide between the U.S. and Russia.
All right. Kirit Radia, thank you so much for joining us from St. Petersburg. You can, of course, get a complete recap right here on abcnews.com. For now, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital Special Report.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.